Hi, my name is Wendy. We're here with meetadvisors.com. We are with Dan Proft, the morning guy on WLS, right? You have a morning show, and you also were a past gubernatorial candidate.
All true.
Yes. So I know you, but why don't you tell the public a little bit about yourself?
Well, as you mentioned, I do a radio talk show host for the morning drive show on WLS, 89 WLS, WLS-AM.com, you know, doing all of the typical promotion. And it's a political news talk show, and I've been involved in politics and government for about the past 20 years in the city and the state since I graduated from Northwestern. And so kind of a policy and political guy who morphed into media through happenstance, a circuitous path to media.
Gotcha. But you also ran the paper at Northwestern, am I right? Or ran something of the sort?
Got a little interest in media when I was in college. We started an independent alternative newspaper to the Daily Northwestern on campus, which is actually still in existence today, but to offer some different perspectives on the campus than were being offered through the Daily Northwestern, which was a nice precursor to what's happened over the last 20 years with the fragmentation of media and what the internet has provided, which is the rise of new voices and new outlets with different sensibilities to different audiences. So having that little experience on campus when I was an undergrad, I think was useful as media has evolved over the last 2 decades.
Definitely. And with that segue, we go into what we're going to talk about today, which is prevalent, the name of the show, which is the demise of the newspaper, not only here in Chicago, but other places also. So could you give us a little your experience with that? I know you work in the media, and you are also on TV here and there, but you're primarily radio right now. Do you see, with the demise of the paper, there being a demise at all with the radio?
Well, I mean, media is changing. The landscape is changing. You think about it, when the advent of television occurred about 50 or 60 years ago, everybody got their news from the same place. So if you live in Joliet, you lived in Chicago because everybody was watching the nightly newscast and getting their information from the same place, talking about the same thing the next day at work around the water cooler. And the lesson of that is you've just seen media evolve from print and radio to television to the digital age, is that media creates community. And the community is built around the content that's provided by a particular outlet. So the difference now is, as we move from TV and old media, kind of the paper, the newspaper that you hold in your hand, it's not that newspapers are going away, but they have to evolve with the changing landscape as well. And the more competitive landscape that is out there. People have more outlets, more to choose from. Content is so much more hyper-targeted, and so you have little platoons of interest out there as opposed to kind of 8 million person universe where the nightly newscast is going to serve everybody's content needs, is going to provide information that everybody wants to consume. I think what you've seen, especially the nightly newscasts, and this leads a little bit into newspapers, the network affiliate newscasts, why doesn't anybody under the age of 40 watch them? Is because they don't provide any content that's relevant to people's lives. I mean, if you're in a crack up on the Dan Ryan, that's important to you. That's a traumatic event. If you or a loved one, a friend, is in a car accident, that's important to you and a small circle of people. But it's not important to 8 million people in the Chicago metropolitan area.
Well, that seems to be where a lot of the news outlets, TV especially, go. Sometimes when I'm watching World News Tonight, not as much on that, but I can't believe that they'll talk about some of the things that they'll talk about just to get their public more, just, I think, well-rounded.
Well, I don't know if they're really getting the public more well-rounded. The network affiliate news is traffic accidents, residential kitchen fires, cross-promotion for network programming, sports and weather. That's your network newscast. And it just doesn't have a lot of relevance to a whole swath of people. The nightly newscast at the national level is just a kind of a top line for stories. So it's how much can you tell me about what's happening in the Middle East in 45 seconds? Not much, not a deep dig, but you go to particular blogs or the digital presence of even those media outlets, and you can get much more robust and textured information. And so I think you have the digital space that's providing actually more information for those people that are truly interested in finding out what's happening in the Middle East, or who really want to do a deep dive on what the problem is in the Chicago public school system to keep it local, and so that's really a good thing. So if people kind of complain about the fragmentation, I was in a terrible demise in the newspaper. Well, those outlets that are disappearing, and they're going to be more that disappear. There'll be newspapers in this town in Chicago that are not here a couple of years from now, particularly the Sun-Times, at least not here in their current form. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, because what you have is an evolution of the product, and people that are not providing content that is particularly relevant or building community go away, and that's okay.
And let's just even start with the classifieds, because that's how a lot of these papers make their money, having classifieds on websites like Craigslist would take from that, I would think.
Well, yeah, I mean, you look at the Sun-Times Sunday paper, there's probably 6 ads. I mean, so one of the problems that some newspapers ran into, a lot of newspapers ran into, is they didn't change the revenue model when the competitive landscape changed. And so we're still going to sell advertisements, and we're still going to base it all on subscriptions. And we're going to be late to the dance and trying to figure out how to monetize our digital presence. And those that were latest to the dance are the ones that are most in trouble. Now compare that, for example, with the Wall Street Journal, which is one of the few examples of a subscriber-based newspaper that is actually making money and has for a long time. One of the early adopters of a paywall, where you couldn't get the Wall Street Journal opinion content, their op-ed page, without paying for it, without subscribing. But they were providing content to a specific audience that was interested in that content and would pay for it. So that's very different than what some of these other outlets have provided.
Right. I know that there's a New York journalist who made a quote, something along the lines of, now that we're able to go online and write, what have you, we become our own editors, which is an interesting fact that you don't think, always think of like the hardcore editor fixing things in the paper, and now people have become their own editors and what have you, I think.
Well, yeah. Well, that's happening. But, I mean, people have become their own editors who are employed at big newspapers, too. I mean, you don't have the layers of editorial oversight, copy editing at the Sun-Times, the Tribune, like you used to. So some of the changes are painful because sometimes the product isn't as refined as it could be. But that's the nature of a dynamic media landscape. And so the people that figure out how to produce content cheaper, but make sure that content still has context and consequence for people, context and consequence, are the ones that are going to win. And they should win, because people are saying, well, you're giving me value-added information I can use, information that's relevant to my life, information that informs how I behave. And that's what media is supposed to provide. Do
you see that changing at all with news? Do you see it going in any other direction besides what it is now, just negativity? Do you see it at all changing? Well, I mean, I don't think it's all negativity. I think it's a question of communities of interest, as I said before. So, I mean, I think it will continue to change and evolve. The great thing about the digital age is you hear from voices that you would not have otherwise heard from in the day where there was 3 nightly newscasts and 1 or 2 major daily newspapers, and they controlled essentially the flow of information. It is not like that anymore, and so you can have bloggers who produce content that has more value and thus creates more bandwidth for them and that blog than newspapers that have been around for 100 years. I think that's an exciting environment. I think that's an exciting development. It turns out that, maybe not everybody at the New York Times or the Chicago Tribune or the LA Times, maybe that they are not the only talented people when it comes to news gathering and news production. The challenge is on the kind of verification side, right? You have to produce content that is reliable, but that's a competitive environment too. If your blog produces content that turns out to be false, or turns out to be improperly sourced, or turns out to be plagiarized, then that will be discovered in the context of a competitive environment where you have different people in the same space competing for the same eyeballs. So I know that you're somewhat into blogging. I know you've blogged for a different company, not your own, maybe personally. Have you seen that at all? Has that all been ever had experience with someone not having the full backup of what they say? Sure. I mean, people get it wrong all the time. It turns out that people in media are not infallible any more than anybody else in any other sector, despite what some of them protest to be. They're not, so they get it wrong. And also because there is such a rush to be first with information, particularly if you're kind of in the breaking news business,
less so the analysis business. But if you're in the breaking news business, there's a rush to get it online right away. And so sometimes things are not sourced as exhaustively as they should be. They're not fact-checked as particularly as they could be. But then you have rise to fact-checkers in that space. So like PolitiFact, that fact-checks the claims that are made in particular blogs or by political candidates. So it's kind of, I mean, media is no different than any other business. And what's the first rule of business? Any successful business solves a problem. So when you go into putting up a blog or starting a media outlet, what is it what is the problem you are attempting to solve? And usually the problem is, I'm going to provide content of a sense and sensibility that is not otherwise being provided to a discernible audience that is interested in this content. And it can be anything from movie reviews, reviews of the lyric opera, to sports, to weather, to politics, and hard news.
I guess that had just been my experience from when I do get ready in the morning and I watch the news. I see a lot of negativity, and I know that it has been proven that if you watch that much negativity, don't make me get too deep on you, but I know that it impacts a lot of people. So that's been my experience. So
but it goes back to what we were saying before. You're doing a quick watch of the local newscasts, and so what do they have? Car accidents, the murder du jour in Inglewood, and then cross promotion for other network programs and your sports.
And then they go into the cute puppy segment.
Yeah, right. I mean, if they've got a picture of a squirrel water skiing in a bathtub, then you get a little bit of that, and but that's it. So it's kind of fluff and depression, and that's why you kind of are indicating maybe it's not the most pressing thing for me to watch, because how truly important is it to you, the content they're providing? How relevant is it to you? And essentially what you're saying is it's not terribly relevant.
Well, Bill Zwecker is the one who keeps me to keep watching.
Right, the entertainment. Well, right, exactly.
Bill.
Yeah.
So, okay, so do you see it all with the demise of the paper, media, not so much other outlets, but do you see it at all affecting politics, locally or otherwise?
It does. It affects politics in a number of ways. One is the spend, right? Campaigns are expensive propositions. And so now you're seeing less spend. I mean, you see no spend on newspapers. No political campaign is buying newspaper ads anymore, just like most businesses aren't. And so that spend is migrating towards the digital space. And now, because of all of the information that's gathered by search engines and companies that are in the business of gathering consumption habits online, now people are using a lot of the money they raise, more and more of the money they raise, not just on the television advertisements or radio advertisements or mail pieces that you would get via snail mail, but hyper-targeted email campaigns, social media campaigns, being much more robust with their web presence, not just for raising money, but also for distributing content, especially because it's cheaper to do so. So it is changing the way it's changing the way campaigns are run in particular, maybe not the messaging as much, but certainly the way campaigns are run and how they spend the money they raise to communicate to voters.
Right. Very good. Well, with that, we'd like to say thank you to Dan. How could our huge public contact you or know more about you in the future? Do you have a website?
Well, the radio station, WLS-AM.com is the radio station, podcast for your listening convenience.
Podcast.
And then I'm also part of a C4 organization, a public policy organization called Illinois Opportunity Project. And you can go to ilopportunity.org for more information about that public policy involvement.
Very good. Well, this is Wendy saying thank you. You could see us at meetadvisors.com, and we'll be, the name of the show is Prevalent, so there'll be more prevalent information in the near future. Check us out. Thank you.